don't know me, I have a podcast called Leadermorphosis, and I interview many people who are speaking at this conference, in fact. And I'm really passionate about sharing stories and examples of new ways of working to really help embolden people like you who are, experimenting, exploring, wanting to change society and organizations and the world. And I also do a lot of trainings and coach teams that want to work in a self-managed way. And I wanted to share with you today something that I hope will offer a way into another perspective, another way of seeing adopting new ways of working that will help you perhaps unlock new ideas, new ways of doing things, and maybe save you some unnecessary pain or discomfort along the way, avoid some pitfalls. So when I'm talking to people on the podcast, or people who are like you, perhaps starting to explore new ways of working or have been doing it for even a few years, I hear a lot of kind of complaints, struggles, protests, frustrations. So maybe you've heard some of these as well, or maybe you've said some of these things. So things that I hear a lot are things like, so, we've said we're self-managing organization now. Why aren't people self-managing? Why aren't they stepping in? Or, some people really like it and are really running with it, and some teams are really stuck and they don't get it, and they're really sort of slow to figure it out. Or, it's really a lot of effort and it's taking a lot of time. And, what about, the real work or the actual work? Don't we need to have time for that at some point? People are even using self-management as an excuse for doing whatever they want. So there's like misconceptions about what it is or what it isn't. And I've put self-management or self-managing here, but you could replace that with Teal or holacracy or whatever system or approach that you're playing around with. And sometimes people say, wow, things are worse now than they were before. Or this doesn't seem good for diversity, equity, inclusion. It seems to kind of privilege or advantage certain people. So maybe you can share, like in the chats, like if you just put yes, if even one of these things resonates with you, if you've said something like this, or you've heard someone saying something like this. Yeah, so a few of you have, right? So I find that it's really valuable in this movement, in this community, to kind of talk about the reality of this, to share with each other that it can be really hard, that it can be difficult, and to be compassionate with ourselves and with each other. That, if you're trying out these things and you're finding it hard, it doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It doesn't mean that self-management or Teal or whatever doesn't work. It just means that it's hard, right? That this is a completely different way of doing things. It's a completely other paradigm. And so it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be difficult. So these things are sort of part of the process. So I don't know if this helps you to feel sort of seen and heard, but you're not alone in feeling this. So I want to share, what I've noticed are some common kind of automatic approaches to starting to introduce or explore new ways of working, and maybe offer an alternative one that could help, shift. It's not going to make these things go away. I'm not promising that, but it might sort of ease it a little bit, or sort of reassure you that it's a process, right? So the first approach that I find people often adopt when they are exploring new ways of working is a kind of mindset that I call installing. So it's sort of like we see introducing new ways of working as like an app to install or software to install, something that we can sort of put in the organization and it will take care of things. So I might be thinking, if I'm a leader in this organization or someone who is, driving this process, how can I get them to, or how can we get them to, how can we get people to get self-management? How can we get people to start to make decisions more, or, give each other feedback more, or have more autonomy or whatever. So it's sort of this like, how can we design something? What structure, what process, what are we going to do? And it's also often like frustrating, like, why don't they get it? Or why aren't they getting it faster? Why is it taking so long? Why can't they just? So there's a sort of like confusion, like we've installed this thing, we've adopted the holacracy constitution, or, everyone's read Reinventing Organizations and we've said we're self-managing now. What's going on? Why isn't it happening? And in general, it's like, there's an assumption that this system, whatever it is, will solve things. If we change the structure, if we change the system, everything else will take care of itself. So it's a bit like this metaphor of like, downloading something onto your smartphone, right? And thinking that that's going to take care of everything. Now, just to be clear, like, I'm not saying that this is bad or wrong. And if if this is how you're approaching things, it's like, don't beat yourself up about it. This is sort of how we're conditioned. And I think it's very easy to see the solutions out there and think, oh, this is going to be the thing that solves everything. And it's only part of the picture. So I'm not sort of, telling you off if this is what you're doing. It's natural. And the second approach I often find people adopt is what I would call abdicating. In other words, sort of stepping back or letting go too much or too far, you could say. So in this approach, I'm thinking, for example, if I'm a leader or if I'm someone with rank in the organization, i.e. someone who has been there a long time, someone who has lots of expertise or experience, or someone who's, the founder, or, someone who's leading this approach to new ways of working, then I might think, oh, that something's not working over there, but I can't say anything about that anymore because we're self-managing now. So a lot of leaders tell me that they feel like, am I allowed to say something? Am I allowed to ask a question or give feedback if I see that something's not working? Because when we're self-managing, right? Like, I'm no one's boss anymore. So there's this sort of hesitance and this sort of stepping back. And at the other end of the spectrum, people who aren't in sort of leadership roles or who don't have rank, maybe they're more junior, or, they haven't been in a managerial position previously. You hear a lot of people saying things like, well, I don't have to do that anymore because it's self-managed now and I can do what I want, right? And I'm exaggerating a bit, but it's often not far away from that, where people sort of, you might experience this as like, there's a cluster of responsibilities now that we're self-managed or Teal that mysteriously no one is taking accountability for. They're not getting done. And no one wants to sort of touch them because everyone's like, oh, but it's autonomy and we're self-managed, right? So a kind of joke I want to share here is when I interviewed Chuck Blakeman for the podcast, he's an author and he's been helping organizations for decades become self-managing. And he made a joke that, don't declare we're self-managing and then say, I'll be on the golf course. So there's something about like, it's not about kind of controlling and tightly holding this process and designing it in a darkened room and then revealing it. And it's also not stepping back completely or too far, so there's these sort of polarities. And the metaphor or the example I often share is like, if in your office you've ever had this principle that, taking out the trash is everyone's responsibility, and then found that no one takes the trash out. This is one of the problems, I think, of this sort of abdicating mindset or this abdicating approach, is that there's something else needed for people to really step in, for there to be co-leadership. It's not sort of stepping away completely. So you could say, like, the problems or the limits of the installing mindset, you could say it's kind of like a power over dynamic. And the problem is that people become codependent. They sort of depend on you or whoever it is that is doing all of this work to design and carefully create this environment for people. And so they become a bit passive. It becomes this dynamic of like, everyone else sort of just waits, for something to be solved or designed, rather than everyone being co-responsible and co-producers. And it ends up that, people end up trying to convince people. So the people who like self-management or Teal or whatever are sort of convincing the others, no, this is great, I promise, you know, it's going to be autonomy, and like, just try it. And we end up in a convincing mode. And sometimes there's this us versus them dynamic where it's like the people who really like it and get it, and the people who don't, and they start to sort of clash, and there's resistance on both sides. And I've spoken to some organizations recently who've been experimenting with self-management for a few years, and now this us versus them dynamic has grown to the point that even the word self-management has become really like taboo, you know, like Voldemort. We daren't speak its name because it's so kind of polarizing. So that can also happen. And in general, it's unsustainable, right? Because it's a few people who are being responsible for how we create, develop new ways of working. And then the sort of limits or the problems with the abdicating mode, and I guess you could describe the abdicating mode a bit like the green paradigm in Frederic Laloux's terminology, where, you know, we kind of get stuck in that everyone needs to be equal, that we need to have this harmony all the time. And you end up with an accountability vacuum and a leadership vacuum. So there's this sort of mindset maybe that bossless means leaderless, and any kind of leadership is bad. And so that kind of breeds resentment, and people don't know how to hold each other to account, and things become unclear, and sort of, you know, you get stuck in a different way. So I think what I want to share is that I see that there is a tendency with both of these mindsets in a way. It stems from a way of seeing, adopting new ways of working, which is kind of alluded to it before, which is thinking about apps. So different structures and processes, thinking about it like a change initiative, or introducing agile teams or agile ways of working, or self-managing teams, or hey, we're inspired by Buurtzorg, let's introduce team coaches, or, you know, sociocracy or holacracy. And again, all of these systems are really valid and valuable. So I'm not saying that structures and processes are not important. They absolutely are. But there's a missing piece, I think, that if we're not aware of, installing these apps alone is not going to be sufficient. It's not going to give us the shift that we need, and we're going to keep bumping into problems. So the missing piece, as my colleagues at TUF and I call it, is like the operating system. Now, I know some of you might have read the book Brave New Work by Aaron Dignan, and our use of this word operating system is a little bit different. What we mean by operating system is like our mindset, how we see things, how new ways of working occurs to us, how we see each other, how we see work, how we see leadership, how we see accountability, how we see money. So mindset kind of drives everything else, and our way of being as well, and our culture, you know, how it feels, the sort of the atmosphere, the climate in the teams, what are the norms, like, you know, how does it feel to be here? You know, you can feel that when you walk into a company. And sort of underneath all of that is the paradigm, the way of relating to new ways of working, to each other, to all of these things. So I know that might sound a bit abstract, so I'm going to try to put some more words to, you know, what I mean by that, or what an alternative approach could look like if we're sort of coming from operating system, from kind of mindset, way of being. And it's funny because I added this slide just now because Jos de Blok this morning at Teal Around the World had this great quote that's just perfect for what I'm talking about. He said something like, the most common reason why self-managing teams don't work is the skills and the attitude of the management team. So if you see it as a trick of changing the structure, it won't work. It's a mindset. So he and I are sort of aligned on that. It's not only structures and processes, there is a missing piece, right? So oftentimes I tell people, you know, bossless doesn't mean leaderless. Bossless means, you know, we're aiming for leaderful, where we want to unleash leadership across the organization in all sorts of places where it wouldn't normally emerge from. So to sort of quickly summarize, it's the mindset then becomes having like a coaching mindset. So instead of, you know, I need to solve this, or I need to create the solution, or I need to have the answers, it's more like asking questions, you know, listening for what wants to happen now with this group of people in this moment. Maybe they're not ready to reinvent everything, but what are they ready to reinvent? Like where are the real sticking points and issues? And let's start there, where the energy is. What's in the way of our purpose? What's needed? So again, it's almost like to focus on self-management or Teal or the thing sometimes is a real trap. It's more like starting from that place and then seeing, you know, what's in service of that. So it's more like power with, to use Mary Parker Fullett's term. So it's like coaching, it's partnership, and it's psychological safety and accountability. So it's not everyone can do whatever they want. It's not fluffy. It's like finding that middle ground and really focusing on the quality of the relationships, upgrading our communication and relationship skills, how we deal with conflicts, how we, you know, raise things instead of sort of being in a role. So in summary, it's like an adult-to-adult paradigm, because you could say the other two, installing and abdicating, are sort of like parent-child paradigms. The installing one is a bit parental, you know, let me help you, I have the answers. And the abdicating one is a bit like a teenage paradigm in a way, where no one's really taking responsibility, everyone's sort of shirking responsibility. So some tips and tools, and I'll just say these quite quickly because I really want to see what questions you have and go from there. I really think it's valuable to train, to practice. You know, we won't change anything by talking about it. We need to practice. So find ways to practice some of the key abilities that work for this, you know, new ways of working world. So things like coaching, asking coaching questions, generative listening, giving feedback in an adult-to-adult way. Ask for feedback, you know, what are your blind spots? Notice your automatic parental sort of tendencies without judgment. So start to build that self-awareness. And then in terms of we skills, you know, upgrade, as I said, communication and relational skills. Start to have conversations about tensions. In tough, we call them pebbles conversations or moosehead conversations, when there's like a taboo, to talk about that, to place that on the table, because there's learning in that. And finally, I really want to stress this, to allow protests, skepticisms, concerns to be, because I think so many times when you've experienced resistance against new ways of working, it's because people will let go of only those concerns they've given voice to. So if we create spaces for them to talk about it, for them to feel heard and seen, then those can be transformed, and it will take time. So it's like, to have patience is one thing. So these are like some notes to self, and then I promise this is my last slide. So I would say to stop comparing with the old picture, because if we compare, if we sort of try and measure or track progress through the old paradigm, it will look chaotic perhaps, or it will look like this isn't leadership, but the terrain is unknown. We're shifting towards something that's totally different. And it's going to take time, and people go at different paces. So again, start with mindset and try to see the signs of shifts through a different lens. You know, it's not going to look like how you would measure things in the old paradigm. But notice things like, oh, people are speaking more openly now, or people are proposing things more often now, or people are taking responsibility. It's not only with the same old people. So it's about courage and faith and commitment.